Today is the start of an hours-long journey explaining why, in most realistic scenarios, Germany cannot win World War II. World War II, as we saw it in our timeline, just wasn't a close match. It wasn't a matter of capture Stalingrad and then you win, or just don't declare war on the US. Germany did very well at the start of the war through a mix of skill and luck, but when compared to the Soviets, but especially the Americans, the Germans were outcompeted in nearly every single metric. Minor changes can help improve the German odds, or even combine to cause a victory, but most of the real, major, war-winning changes are quite unrealistic. So, I have been compiling a list of all the common ways that I've seen suggested to have Germany win World War II. We will discuss their realism and the potential impact that they might have on the odds of a German victory. We will also discuss why most, on their own, are not enough for Germany to win. That being said, a combination of the changes that we will discuss in this series can absolutely be enough, and we shall conclude the series with a combination of some of the most impactful and plausible changes to achieve an as complete Axis victory as possible. If you ever find yourself writing your own Axis victory scenario, consider selecting a number of the more realistic and impactful changes presented in this video to make that happen. To make that process easier, I will rate each proposed change from a 1 to 10 in both impact and realism. Impact shows how much it benefits the Germans, and realism shows how likely it was to occur. Of course, take all of those numbers with a big grain of salt. They are just a broad illustration of how I would personally rate them. But before we dive in, we do need to define what a victory looks like for Germany. This is key, because it is actually extremely easy to get Germany into some form of limited victory. For example, just stop after annexing Czechoslovakia. There you go, Germany is now larger and more populous than their Western neighbors and can work to, diplomatically and economically, reassert itself as a great power in Eastern Europe, presenting itself as the bulwark against Bolshevism. But while an outcome like this, which diplomatically and militarily would be very possible for Germany, ignores a very fundamental point. It's not even close to what the German leadership wanted to achieve. We will see in many of the changes I will explore in this series that time after time after time, the changes I will be proposing require at least a decent rethinking amongst the very highest of German leadership. There is a reason World War II went the way it did, and a lot of it was because of the ideology and megalomania amongst the German high command. The German regime of 1938 was never going to stop after Czechoslovakia. Why? Because the very fact that they got to annex the country proved Western weakness and pushed them to demand even more. Besides, Czechoslovakia was never a goal, it was merely a pawn for far greater ambitions, like the humbling of the West and the destruction of the Soviet Union, thereby securing Lebensraum and German hegemony over Europe. So let me set the parameters I consider crucial to saying, okay, Germany has now truly achieved a victory. First, achieve dominance over at the very least Eastern Europe, minus the Soviet Union for now. This point mainly entails destroying the influence of the West in the region, whether politically, militarily, or economically. Second, peace with the United States is quite literally a must. Why? Because on a conventional level, the United States outcompetes Germany in every metric. It's not even close. Any war with the Americans, if the Americans take it seriously, will, in the best case for Germany, lead to a complete encirclement of Europe and a grinding war of attrition, if not, ending in nuclear apocalypse for Germany. Thirdly then, Germany needs to conquer Russia, at the very least up to the AA line, thereby destroying the ability of whatever remains to compete with Germany. Again, ideologically speaking, there is no world where Germany considers the war truly over until this is achieved, unless we completely rewire their leadership. Only if these three conditions are met am I comfortable in saying that Germany has won World War II. Anything else is merely a pause in the fighting. A pause that, as we will explore plenty across this series, is not beneficial to Germany. With that said, let's dive right into the first chapter, getting Britain out of the war. Now, I don't think I need to spend much time on why this is a good thing. This is just about the first thing that everybody jumps to in achieving a German victory. Britain being removed from the war achieves a lot for the Germans. It legitimizes their control over Europe. It removes the threat from the West and the South, allowing them to fully focus on the Soviet Union, and it also practically removes the US as a factor, as FDR wouldn't be able to send Lend-Lease in any large capacity to the Soviets without Britain being in the war. So, let's discuss the common ways to get the British out of the war, as well as the impact it might have on the conflict. Now first, the impact. How does it improve the odds for Germany? Well, let's assume that something like a white peace is signed with the British. Germany is allowed to keep their gains in Europe, but Britain doesn't give up anything themselves. This would now allow Germany to at least temporarily de-occupy certain regions in Western Europe, absolutely still keeping them as puppet regimes, but lessening the direct German oversight. Germany's full attention can now go to the coming war with the Soviets. There is no need to send forces to Africa. The Air Force isn't occupied in Britain. There are no British counter-bombings on Germany, and no, even if small, risks for a British invasion of Europe. And, perhaps most importantly, Germany would be reopened to global trade. All of these factors are extremely beneficial to Germany and would greatly increase their chances against the Soviets. But there are issues, which go often under-discussed in alternate history, preventing this from being an immediate home run for the Germans. First, Stalin. In our timeline, Stalin acted like an idiot. Everybody knew that the Germans were going to invade the Soviet Union in 1941, yet Stalin refused to listen. This is often turned into a joke, or used to show Stalin as incompetent. Yet, there was far more at play here, and no, it also wasn't blind trust in the Germans and their non-aggression pact. Rather, Stalin's reasoning was very simple. The entire reason behind the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was to prevent a two-front war for Germany. Surely, the Germans weren't about to invade the Soviets before Britain was even out of the conflict. After Germany signed a peace with Britain, this logic would be gone, and the Soviets are far more likely to take the German threat more seriously. While I doubt that this means that the Germans get halted at the start of their invasion, it could drastically reduce the amount of captured Soviet soldiers and equipment, and potentially also save their air force, which they could have pulled further behind the front lines. So, while the Germans are now favored to win the war against the Soviets, it is still not a cakewalk. It is very unlikely that the Germans destroy the Soviets by 1943 unless we implement some other changes. Of course, by this point, the Soviets will be struggling industrially, militarily, logistically, and in their food supply, but the Soviets, at least in a defensive capacity, will be able to keep on fighting. After all, they knew what was at stake here: a war of extermination. Surrender meant complete destruction, and therefore few would advocate for it, however bad the war conditions got. This is important as it opens the door for the rest of the world to get involved again. Regardless of events in Europe, Asia would also come on the move. Despite Germany's peace with Britain, Japan is still at war with China and will occupy Indochina. Both moves which will put the Americans on high alert. This will eventually lead to the oil embargo of our timeline and Japan choosing to strike Pearl Harbor and risk it all on a huge war, bringing America out of isolation. Despite the fact that peace was signed with Germany, until France, Scandinavia, and the Low Countries are restored as fully independent states, Britain will remain wary of German ambitions. Everyone in Britain in 1940 knew peace now would only be a temporary ceasefire, as eventually Germany and Italy will return to try and end the British Empire. Britain simply cannot accept a Germany ruling over all of Europe, especially not while dominating the other side of the English Channel. This is an aspect of peace with Britain few ever talk about. Yes, Germany gets the benefit of not being at war, but so does Britain. Britain wouldn't just sit around, giving up on their position as a superpower. They would spend the peacetime years preparing for the next conflict with the Germans, just as they had once done with Napoleon. Then they would start to get involved again. First, by assisting the Soviets, just to stall the Germans out more. Second, by attempting some more direct interventions, likely in communications with the Americans. This could come with the US and UK putting economic pressure back on the Germans, hoping that the Germans eventually strike out in retaliation or, in some other way, give out a casus belli for war. I very much expect that in 1943 or 1944, the British, this time on their own conditions, attempt to go back to war, with a reformed and stronger air force, and unconditional American economic, if not military backing. While the conclusion of such a scenario is completely different to our own, likely with the Soviet Union crippled beyond anything seen in our timeline, unlikely to lead a major bloc in the Cold War, this theoretical restarting of the British-German conflict, likely drawing in America too, will likely doom the Germans. Again, even if for the simple fact that the Manhattan Project would likely still be worked on. For these reasons, while an absolutely massive boost to the German odds of victory, peace with Britain is just not enough to do the trick by itself, and I would likely rate it at around a 9 out of 10 in terms of impact. The only reason it is not a 10 out of 10 is because of the likelihood of Britain getting involved again later, assuming the Soviets don't swiftly surrender. But just by adding a few small changes to Operation Barbarossa to have the Soviets struggle more and earlier, and you have basically achieved a German victory. But let's now discuss how we can actually make this happen and how realistic this is. Now, we all know the most common way to remove Britain from the war. They would lose at Dunkirk, and the demoralized British politicians and population would cry out for peace. Churchill's attempt to rally the government against the Germans fails, as Lord Halifax takes the central stage. He argues that the war is unwinnable and that there is no point in continuing the conflict. Communications to Germany are opened and peace is discussed. Britain has surrendered. Now, I have two big issues with this course of events. The first problem is in how a devastating defeat at Dunkirk would have even occurred in the first place, while my second problem is how the British peace attitudes, and especially the figure of Lord Halifax, are often portrayed in history. So first, having Germany just win at Dunkirk is not that simple. It is often portrayed as the Germans foolishly halting an unstoppable march of progress destined to wipe out the British. But this just isn't the case. The German offensive in France was insanely impressive, but by the time of Dunkirk, the frontline forces were undersupplied, far away from convoys, reinforcements, and most importantly, forces to hold the flanks and the back. Continuing was, very correctly, deemed very risky by the German command. So a minor 2-day pause in the offensive was announced for the Germans to reorganize their forces. Beyond that, the British were also not just some sitting ducks waiting for a capture. 400,000 well-equipped Allied soldiers were still ready for a fight and could absolutely hold back the Germans for a long while as others escaped. In fact, a largely unsung reason that Dunkirk was as successful as it was were the valiant defenses that the 60,000 French soldiers put up, with 18,000 Frenchmen dying to defend their British comrades. Now, absolutely, there are things that Germany can do to improve their chances, like putting more of their effort on the operation or just recklessly continuing the attack and hoping that that doesn't backfire. But my point here is that it is not as simple as the Germans just being stupid and letting the British escape. The Germans paused their offensive for just 2 days before restarting pressure on the forces at Dunkirk, after which the Allies valiantly defended their position for 8 days while the evacuation was taking place. It is absolutely possible, in a number of ways, to have Dunkirk be more of a disaster, but it requires a lot more than Germany just standing in the tanks, to wipe away all of the Allied forces easily. But let's assume that Dunkirk was a disaster. What then? Well, many imagined that Churchill, the war hawk, would get ousted by his own war cabinet, as they would all unite behind the cowardly figure of Lord Halifax. This concept is based on some historical fact, as in 1940 there was indeed a war cabinet crisis between Churchill and Halifax. But it didn't go exactly as often suggested. The core issue at hand was the French Premier Renaud informing the British that they were considering a separate surrender, and suggesting that the British reach out to Roosevelt or Mussolini to discuss terms with the Germans. The situation was complicated. Churchill wanted to fight on regardless, while all Halifax wanted to do is discuss what the Germans might offer to see if the proposed peace could be acceptable to London. Meanwhile, both sides sought to appease the French to keep them into the war for as long as possible. Now 6 men made up the war cabinet: Churchill, Halifax, Attlee, Greenwood, Sinclair and Chamberlain. Generally, Churchill could count on Attlee, Sinclair and Greenwood, all 3 of whom supported the continuation of the war. Halifax, as discussed, preferred looking for a peace deal, while Chamberlain was torn between the 2 sides. Despite the seeming 4-2 majority in favor of Churchill, even in the worst case scenario, it gets more complicated. Churchill was the Prime Minister, but Chamberlain was still the leader of the Conservative Party, which held the majority in Parliament. If Chamberlain chose, at any point, he could bring down Churchill's entire government. So, could he have been convinced? Well, it seems rather unlikely. Times had changed since the naive Chamberlain declared peace for our time after the Munich conference. Chamberlain had generally agreed with Churchill's perspective that any negotiations with the Germans were pointless, as they would just demand too much anyways, and besides would likely break any treaty that they signed. He also saw Mussolini with great distrust, seeing him as nothing more than a German puppet, meaning that negotiations through him would just be adding additional steps to a doomed negotiation. Now it's also important to note that this cabinet crisis took place from the 26th until the 28th of May. The Dunkirk evacuation took place between the 26th of May and the 4th of June. While this entire crisis was unfolding, the fate of the British Expeditionary Force was still very unclear, as the loss of all heavy equipment was already accepted and only about a sixth of the forces had actually been evacuated. Considering this, it seems unlikely that a loss at Dunkirk would have significantly influenced Chamberlain's decision, as even before it was a success, he had already accepted the need to continue the war. The consensus amongst the war cabinet was clear. Any peace with Germany would be no worse than fighting until the end now, as it would just be a repeat of the Munich conference. A pause in hostilities, allowing Germany to consolidate their gains before they would strike again. Also influential in the government's decision-making is that the British military had reached a consensus that as long as the Royal Navy and Air Force remained operational, which at the moment seemed very likely, there was no immediate risk for an invasion of Britain. Even if we assume that before or during the cabinet crisis, Dunkirk becomes a complete disaster, it is doubtful that that alone is enough to let Halifax convince Chamberlain and sway the war cabinet, especially once Churchill makes it clear that he will not seek peace, which would force Chamberlain to bring down the entire government. A very destabilizing move at this point in the war that he will likely not seek to take. But perhaps the biggest point in this entire ordeal: what did Halifax even want to accomplish? Many imagine him as a sad, small, depressed, pessimistic man, preferring to just throw in the towel since a British defeat was inevitable anyways. This has never and would have never been the case, even after a disaster at Dunkirk. This is the fundamental flaw behind most scenarios which use Halifax to reach a peace deal. All that Lord Halifax and his supporters wanted to do was reach out to Mussolini and see what the German offer for peace was, and then discuss whether or not it would have been acceptable to Britain. Even Lord Halifax realized that this process would most likely be a purely academic undertaking, meaning he very much expected Germany would demand way too much. Still, the one thing he argued for was that there was no harm in trying. This was under no circumstance Lord Halifax suggesting the British should surrender. In fact, his hope was that the settlement reached could limit German gains in France, preserving their independence, and with it, Britain's influence in Western Europe. So, if Halifax did reach out for peace, what would the Germans demand? Well, the tamest version of Germany's demands that I have found are along these lines. Britain and colonies remain untouched, while Germany's hegemony over Europe is confirmed. French, Belgian, and Dutch colonies are open to discussion. Now, on paper, this may seem like a decent proposal, but remember that the British were dealing with literally Hitler, and they were very aware of this fact. Accepting any deal of this variety means Germany consolidating control over Europe with Italy, while, from their position in northern France, plans are made for an eventual conquest of Britain. If Britain did seriously accept the proposal as outlined here, and Europe falls under unconditional German authority, allowed to conquer Russia unopposed, tell me, what security guarantee does Britain have after this? What exactly would be stopping Germany after the fall of Russia from turning around and invading the British homeland? Any such terms would be unacceptable to Churchill, most of the war cabinet, but most importantly, to Chamberlain, and yes, even Lord Halifax himself. Now, there are ways to make the peace discussions at least a bit more likely to occur. After the disastrous Norway campaign, Chamberlain would stand down as Prime Minister. Most preferred none other than Lord Halifax as his replacer, but Halifax refused. This was for a simple reason. He was a member of the House of Lords, basically the British Senate. As a Lord, he could not debate in the House of Commons, the UK's House of Representatives. As you can imagine, this is a quite crucial pastime for British Prime Ministers, meaning he couldn't effectively govern the House. Still, he could very well have accepted the position, thereby being in a much better position to at least reach out to Germany for terms. So, if we're assuming that Lord Halifax becomes the Prime Minister and Dunkirk is a disaster, we'd still have to assume that Germany goes with a tame list of demands, as even what we described previously is likely already too much for Britain to accept. It is far from unlikely for Germany to blow up negotiations by bringing up their colonial ambitions, suggesting that Gibraltar is Spanish or that the Suez should be international, Malta should be Italian, or even suggesting an Anglo-German alliance against the Soviets, or even worse, the Americans. Even if the Germans refrained themselves from such demands, they'd be walking a tightrope in negotiation, meaning a suspicious and paranoid British delegate who was trying his best to talk Germany down from especially an occupation of northern France. I think it extremely likely that peace talks break down over the specifics of Germany's position in northern France. Though, if Germany does manage to moderate itself and limit their direct influence over a post-war France, restricting themselves to seizing what was known as the closed zone, an area meant to be annexed into Germany, while leaving the rest of northern France relatively independent, a peace deal here becomes possible, but it would still not be very likely. So, those are my arguments for why a scenario where Britain pieces out is far more difficult than often portrayed. A disaster at Dunkirk is more difficult than often shown. It is unclear whether this would even change Chamberlain's stance in the war cabinet, and Halifax winning doesn't even necessarily guarantee the signing of a peace treaty. For any peace to become an option, we'd need Halifax to come into a position of power over Britain, and crucially, for Germany to not overstep their demands for peace. For this reason, while I don't deny the immense benefit and likely even necessity of the British piecing out against the Germans, the odds of them doing so merely because of Dunkirk I would rate very low, potentially at around a 3. But it is very possible to spike higher with changes like Halifax as the Prime Minister, or a number of other conditions which we will discuss later in this video. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, including 4 more videos in this series, consider doing so. Thank you. Now, one of the ways people suggest weakening Britain further, making a potential surrender more likely, is in the way Germany conducted the Battle for Britain. Basically, right after the fall of France, the Germans began preparing an intense air campaign over Britain, targeting airfields, ports, air defenses, and other key military targets over the British Isles. The goal was a complete defeat of the Royal Air Force, which would, at best, force Britain to reconsider negotiating, and if they didn't, then it would at least allow Germany to flatten the nation, while hopefully weakening the Royal Navy enough for a naval invasion to become a possibility, albeit an unlikely one. Now, a commonly held belief is that Germany was oh so close to completely wiping out the functionality of the Royal Air Force. But then, in a moment of desperation, Churchill launched a daring bombing run over Berlin. The German command was so angered at this move that they demanded that the Luftwaffe shift their focus to terror bombing London and other British cities in retribution. This, supposedly, saved the British Air Force, which could use the downtime to repair their capacity and win the battle for Britain. This view, however, is wrong, as it very much ignores the pressures that was being put on Germany. In the months before Germany began focusing on London, they were losing about 20% of their active fighters each month, as well as about 15% of bombers. These are numbers which just aren't sustainable, not just in terms of aircraft production, but more importantly in terms of trained pilots, as each plane that crashes over British territory or the ocean represented a pilot forever lost to the enemy. Even worse, the damage on Britain's air force has been grossly overestimated, as their fighter capacity remained roughly on the same level across this period. Britain was actually outproducing the Germans in terms of airplane. Fact is, Germany was risking their entire air force for negligible results on Britain's operational capacity, continuing the battle for Britain in the same intensity as they did in August and September of 1940 was just not a viable option. So, even if we assume that, and again, this is wrong, Germany had indeed ripped up all the airfields that Britain could use in just 3 months, they would still need to eventually slow down and regroup. Constructing ad hoc airfields is not that complicated, as just about any long stretch of asphalt can do if necessary. As long as British aircraft factories remained operational, which, without strikes on cities, they absolutely would, Britain would be able to bounce back their air force whenever Germany regrouped. Now, you may think me unfair, writing off German losses as unsustainable and British losses as recoverable. The reason for this, though, is quite simple. Beyond Germany just suffering more losses and utilizing more planes, Britain is fighting over their own territory. Not only do less British planes go down, if they do, it is over British soil. Pilots and even partially damaged planes can be salvaged, fixed, and sent back to fight another day. In contrast, any German plane is not just lost, they are captured by the British and their pilots arrested. Each plane going down is far more of an issue for Germany than it can ever be for Britain. Now, that is not to say that Germany can't ever win the Battle of Britain, depending on what winning looks like. But it would require an earlier and continual focus on building airplanes, training up new pilots, and preparing for multiple months, if not years, of a war of attrition with little to no guarantee of success. Also, the terror bombing on British cities are often disregarded as pointless, since they failed to bring Britain to a point of surrender. But in terms of damage to industry, housing, infrastructure, and general discomfort for the British nation, and all of that for a lesser cost than the targeted focus on military installations, it makes me wonder if switching to just military targets would indeed have been better for the Germans. Either way, the air war, even in an optimistic scenario, does not offer a direct route of victory to Germany. And even in optimistic scenarios, I doubt that this change would have a much greater impact than around a 6. In terms of Realism 2, this change would get around a 4. It is not completely insane to think that it might have happened, but even in terms of purely military strategy, it is unclear that it is definitely the better course of action. Besides this, it would require a change in the German mindset, as when they launched their first strikes on London, they had truly believed that the Royal Air Force was practically destroyed. As the German pilots supposedly quipped when the British fighters confronted them, "Here come the last 50 Spitfires." Yes, the bombing of Berlin was also one of the reasons for the shift in German strategy, but not the only one. General ideology, hubris, and the unsustainability of the operation were similarly major reasons. Now, Germany attempting Operation Sea Lion is a scenario that I have actually covered in full before, but the TLDR of it is that a direct German invasion of Britain in any reasonable time frame is basically impossible. Even in a best case scenario, where by 1941 there was a massive reduction to the British Air Force and even a weakening of the Royal Navy, the Germans would at best be able to, at massive cost to men, ship and air, land about 300,000 soldiers on the island. To defend, the British had, at minimum, 1.5 million soldiers, decently armed with recently purchased American equipment. When Germany invaded France, they started at around a 1-to-1 ratio of manpower, which swiftly turned to the Germans having the advantage due to their victories around the Ardennes. In Britain, from the very start, the Germans are fighting a 5-to-1 disadvantage. Don't expect a swift blitz of Britain. It would be a grinding war of attrition on the islands, one that very much favors the defender. Even if at great cost, the Royal Navy and Air Force would cripple German attempts to resupply their invasion, until, eventually, the entire German force on the island is captured, as Germany will no longer have the ships needed to pull their own Dunkirk. Britain's navy is irreversibly crippled, and it is unlikely to ever again rule the waves. But Germany lost their own naval fleet in the process as well, meaning that, at least for this war, Britain's reduced navy isn't that big of a deal. Of course, all of this is already assuming a best case scenario for Germany. More realistically, the invasion starts to struggle far earlier. Should Germany choose, they will almost always be able to pull off some landing operation in Britain, but most of their landing craft will already be destroyed in the first wave. So, in a best case scenario, without significant pre-war changes to weaken Britain and strengthen Germany, all that is accomplished is the crippling of the Royal Navy, a benefit that Germany itself will not be able to take advantage of. So, in terms of impact, I will rate this change at around a 3 out of a 10 for Germany. It is very much actively harmful to Germany's military, as hundreds of thousands of troops are lost, as well as their navy and air force being greatly damaged. But it is also not enough to immediately lose them the war or completely destroy their chances in a war against the Soviets. In terms of realism though, it likewise gets around a 2 or a 3, and I'm leaning towards a 3. As things stood in our timeline, Sea Lion just wasn't happening. Even the Germans, prone to overestimating themselves, recognized the impossibility of the operation, setting a number of very difficult to accomplish tasks which needed to be done before Sea Lion was even attempted. These include completely destroying the British Air Force, which we already discussed the difficulty of, mining the entrances of the English Channel fully, lining the French coast with artillery, and weakening the Royal Navy substantially. Achieving these in themselves are already quite difficult, and even then, the Germans would still need to actually invade and overcome the 5-to-1 odds on the island. Of course, with the erratic nature of the German leadership, it being attempted is not impossible, but considering the dictator, the head of the Air Force, and the head of the Navy all agreed that this is madness, it seems very unlikely. Now next up, what if Germany focused earlier and harder on U-boats? After the Treaty of Versailles, harsh restrictions were placed on the once proud fleet of the German Kaiser. Amongst the restrictions on the conventional navy, the nation was allowed to have a grand total of 0 submarines. But to prevent the nation from falling completely behind in technology, even during the Weimar times, German companies in the Netherlands researched submarines, while another company in Sweden researched torpedoes. Then, in 1932, even before the rise of the ultranationalists to power, Germany had begun rebuilding their navy, ordering several submarines and even starting construction on an aircraft carrier, despite both being very much forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles. From 1935 onwards, the rebuilding effort intensified. The so-called Kriegsmarine was to be the Reich's new navy, and it was invested in decently, although the rebuilding effort would suffer very greatly from being the least important out of the three major military branches. In 1939, Germany began Plan Z, a massive undertaking to create a navy capable of contesting the British. Multiple aircraft carriers, battleships, and several smaller ships were ordered, and in terms of submarines, around 250 were planned. But what if Germany realized the power of the submarine far earlier? During the early stages of World War II, from 1939 until mid-1941, only about 40 submarines were actually active at a time, only to rise to about 160 by 1943. By this point though, the British and Americans, through various naval improvements and by cracking Enigma, had substantially reduced the impact of submarines. So, what if Germany, from 1935 onwards, had invested far more of their naval budget into submarines, thereby potentially being able to strike much harder against the British in the early stages of the war? Now here, we swiftly run into the issue of realism. This course of action, at least in significant amount quantities that it actually makes a meaningful difference on the war, would require a recognition by the Germans that competing with the British conventionally was not going to happen in the short term. Besides that, to really make a difference, more resources would need to be directed to the Navy in general, which would need to come from either the Air Force or the Land Army, both parts of the military which were obviously far more important for a nation like Germany. I would put the likelihood of this occurring somewhere in the range of around a 3 or a 4. It is far from unthinkable, but it would require a bit of foresight and a swallowing of German pride that a big surface navy fleet is not happening. But then, would it actually help? During World War II, in its early stages, the German submarine campaign was decently effective. The British were focused on building other things, and couldn't properly dedicate their efforts on constructing civilian shipping, leaving the US and Canada to produce around 93% of Allied shipping during the war. But this build-up effort took a while to get going. From 1939 until around 1942, the Germans consistently sank more Allied tonnage than was being rebuilt, as the net Allied merchant navy declined by about 10 million tons across this time. This was a significant number, as Britain and the Commonwealth began the war with about 21 million tons, meaning about half of Britain's starting merchant capacity had been destroyed by the time that capacity began to increase again. But it is not that simple. Sure, Germany had caused a reduction of 10 million tons of merchant shipping, but the USA had also joined the war, adding around 9 million tons to the Allied merchant fleet. This had already basically wiped out the efforts of the German submarine. Add to this various other minor fleets like the Dutch and Norwegians partially being added to the British total, and it is safe to say that really British shipping was never in any serious danger by German submarine actions. Yet, in this alternate timeline, the core battle will be waged in 1940 and 1941. If the Germans can somehow manage to do significantly better than in our timeline, and earlier, for a larger and more comprehensive submarine campaign, this could be a building block that forces Britain to more seriously consider peace. If tonnage declines significantly across this time, lessening the reserves that they have, threatening British imports, while at the same time Germany puts pressure on Britain and America doesn't yet join the war, then we have a really bad situation for the British to be in. Of course, this does already require a number of changes and assumptions. Now, as a standalone change, the impact of this would be around a 6 or a 7. It is absolutely, potentially, a worthwhile investment for Germany to weaken the British Empire with, but also it is unlikely to fundamentally reshape the war. When coupled with timelines where the US doesn't get involved, the impact can quickly skyrocket to become far more substantial, as Britain feels the pinch of the submarine efforts. Now of course, Germany must then still be careful to not go too far. If Germany neglects their conventional navy to such an extent their invasion of Norway fails, then we are obviously in a situation where things become extremely bad for Germany. But assuming we haven't butterflied away things like Norway, a decently solid change it is. Now that practically concludes the chapter on peace with Britain. My conclusion basically is, peacing out with Britain would be absolutely amazing for the Germans, amongst the best changes to improve their odds of victory, and arguably even a necessity, as it leaves America in a neutral position and allows Germany to focus on the Soviets fully. It is also far from an unthinkable change to have happened, but I did want to raise some awareness that in order to make it happen, you'd need to make a number of conditions become true at once. And it is just not as simple as it is sometimes shown in alternate history. The most key changes that need to take place are Halifax being put into a position of power over the British government, and the Germans then actually presenting a peace deal moderate enough for the British to accept. Now of course, there are a number of other potential changes that I want to, and will, discuss regarding Britain. These include the potential fall of Gibraltar and the complete collapse of the Middle East. But we will discuss those in a later episode. For now, overall, the concept of peace with Britain is not insane, yet it is far more difficult than portrayed. And it will require multiple, decently big changes to fundamentally weaken Britain more to a point where they consider a peace deal, so fundamentally opposed to their interests, like giving up all of Europe and acknowledging German hegemony on the continent. But that is all for today. But remember to subscribe, as there are plenty more episodes in this series releasing in the near future, with the next one tackling the role of America in the war and the changes suggested to keep them from entering the conflict. Thank you all for watching. Consider leaving a like and a comment, as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, then I'm sure that the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.